Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'd like to welcome our audience and our speakers today on a session focusing on preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence. My name is Amira Taha. I'm the Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies Global Coordinator for CARE. And let me welcome all our speakers today. I will be moderating the session for you. And we first, let me set a few ground rules for us. So this session will be recorded. It will be available on the EHF website, hopefully in the coming weeks. We will have a question and answer part of the session following the statements made by our speakers. So we invite you all to prepare your questions, and please do feel free to share them with us. If we do not have enough time to reflect on all your questions, we are also inviting you to share your contact details as part of a registration form that we're circulating in the room. Please feel free to share your contact information, and we will be reaching out to you directly. With this, let me move to our speakers and introduce them before we get started. So to my right hand is Ms. Wissal Abdallah, GBV Prevention and Response Program Coordinator with the Arab Women Organization of Jordan. Seated next to her is Ms. Lindsay Firstland, Deputy Coordinator of the UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict Network, Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Next to her is Ms. Fatima Shehu Imam, Founder and Executive Director of the Rehabilitation, Empowerment and Better Health Initiative from Nigeria. Then seated next to her is Ms. Susanne Friesgeier, Director for Humanitarian Assistance with the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And finally, Mr. Ambassador Guilain Dupe, Deputy Director General for Multilateral Affairs with the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I welcome you all today. Our session today will highlight promising practices on what works to prevent, mitigate, and respond to conflict-related sexual violence in a manner that provides survivor-centered services to survivors, as well as strengthening accountability measures to the affected populations across different countries. We will also use this space today to amplify the voices of local actors to focus on critical actions needed from international organizations and donors to provide an effective, holistic response on conflict-related sexual violence and to meet the needs of those most affected and most at risk. So let me first start with our opening remarks and move the floor to Ms. Friesgeier to provide some opening remarks for the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amira and CARE, for organizing this very important humanitarian talk. I'm really honored to be able to open it. So, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Last year, when I, together with other donor representatives, visited the Democratic Republic of Congo, we also met with survivors of sexual violence. And we could witness ourselves the devastating effects it had not only for those who had to suffer this brutal violation of humanitarian law, but also for their families and communities. And the DRC is, of course, not the only example. Unfortunately, sexual violence remains prevalent and widespread in armed conflict. And this is unacceptable. And this is why it is so important to come together here today to discuss strategies and ways to combat and prevent this scourge. So it is important to underline over and over again that this is not an inevitable byproduct of war. It can and it should be prevented. So what can we do? So our Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, recently launched guidelines for a feminist foreign policy, which call inter alia for equal representation and participation of women and marginalized groups. And it highlighted the importance of rights, representation, and resources. So what exactly does this mean for the fight against sexual violence. So firstly, on rights. Sexual violence is part of a continuum of interlinked forms of structural discrimination and violence against women, girls, and marginalized groups. So we have to put extra effort into upholding international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and to end impunity for all forms of sexual violence. And we also need to focus more on protection and the special needs of survivors, inter alia, ensuring trauma-sensitive approaches. So, and we need to make sure that gender-sensitive planning is included in every pillar of the so-called nexus. So the second point is on resources. Funding for prevention of and fight against gender-based violence should not be an add-on, but integrated from the very beginning in the humanitarian needs assessment. So we have to make sure that our humanitarian assistance is inclusive and at the same time targeted. This means that we have to put the distinct needs of women, girls, men and boys of different ages and abilities in the center of our humanitarian programming. To apply such a gender lens in all HRPs, HCs, and HC teams, Germany finances a project with UN Women, which aims at a more systemic integration of gender aspects in coordination and in planning. So furthermore, we also ask all our project partners to include disaggregated data by gender, age, and disability, an inclusion analysis for marginalized groups, as well as concrete measures and indicators. And by including women-led organizations in the local assessment, we strive to improve their chances to access funding. For example, we should make country-based pooled funds more accessible, hold organizations accountable to their own localization ambitions, or fund consortiums. And thirdly, and maybe most importantly, representation. It is key that those who are affected are heard and included in the needs, assessments, and preventive strategies. And here again, women-led organizations can and they have to play a role. So local actors know best how to address specific needs and challenges, and especially in their respective contexts. So to sum up, we need the systemic integration of SGBV on all levels of humanitarian assistance. In this regard, platforms for collaboration, such as the call to action on protection from gender-based violence in emergencies, are indispensable. That is why Germany has gladly assumed the lead of the CTA and is aiming to facilitate this cooperation, ensure it is output and inclusive, output-oriented and inclusive. So if we speak with one voice on SGBV throughout the system, we will be heard, which is also why I'm very grateful to the organizers of today's panel discussion for the focus on concrete, actionable solutions. And I'm looking forward to the questions that you will raise and the solutions presented today by our distinguished panelists. And so, those who are not yet member of the CTA, please join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susanne, for the opening remarks and for reminding us that conflict-related sexual violence is indeed preventable and for sharing Germany's actionable commitments over the coming period. We now move to our speakers and invite you to start discussing the topics on the agenda for today. So my first question goes to Wissal. Based on your experience in Jordan and in the Middle East, North Africa region, what do you see as the promising practices on GBV prevention, risk mitigation, and response that promote effective, holistic, and survivor-centered approaches to assistance in emergencies? Thank you.
Thank you, Amira. Thank you for the organizers. I will be honest and say if this panel happens 3 or 4 years ago, I will be very stressed to participate, because I will be trying to find any practices that is very concrete to be shown. But recently, we started to see the results of the efforts that international community, humanitarian community, and even local women-led organizations and local actors are doing. I can give examples about the promising practices that I experienced by working with the Arab Women Organization of Jordan on the national, regional, and even global level. One of the examples is that the GBV in Emergencies working group that was formed almost a year ago was formed by the UNFPA/AOR to gather humanitarian actors in the MENA region or the Arab State region. With that working group, AWO, Arab Women Organization, was chosen to be co-chairing this group. So having a leading role in such a group on the regional level, like leverage the capacities and the access to regional, international humanitarian contexts and communities. Also, another partnership or kind of collaboration between UNFPA, UNHCR, and Arab Women Organization was to produce and translate the GBV minimum standards facilitator guide, where that translation was like contextualized to be suitable for the region with the Arabic suitable translation for terminologies and like wording, let's say, and related to GBV minimum standards. Also, we were able to implement that translation and have a couple of, like number of training of trainers on that, where women-led organizations were able to do step-down trainings for other local actors on GBV minimum standards in their own language and in their own context. So such a practice is like can be considered like a promising practice to be built on, because it's kind of like sustainable and low cost, let's say, practice, just to contextualize what we are producing in the humanitarian context. Another big example on like promising practices that the willing of some donors, international donors, to partner with local organizations. For example, the SDC, the Swiss Development Cooperation, has a 2-year project funding to AWO as a lead as a lead in part of CAFI project, and we were able to sub-grant CARE USA in that project. So this is one of the most innovative and new experience. So like we really want to see more international humanitarian donors and actors act like this and like take the big step forward and fund directly women-led organizations and local organizations, because these organizations on local level is in day-to-day updated knowledge and communication with women and survivors. So, and most, if you look like very deep, most of women-led organizations staff and members are already survivors. Like I don't know if it's like suitable to say here, but yeah, we are like survivors of violence in a way or another all over the world. So when we say we know how to respond and we know how to act and we know how to deal with women and girls survivors of violence and any survivor of violence, we know how, not because we want to say we know, but we have like day by day needs assessments and communication with women and girls on the ground. So it's important to have such practice. Also, one more practice to mention is the the successful partnership, equal partnership that we are having with CARE USA and the Call to Action Field Implementation project, where AWO, DFJ, our partner, our consortium partner, has the same weight and the same ability in decision making in this consortium. And we have the ability to say yes or no, or how to implement this and how to implement that. This is a new experience, to be honest, because usually for women-led organizations and local organizations, we have do this and do that. You cannot say no, but with this kind of equal partnership, we were able to say, yeah, we can do that, and no, it's out of context, or we cannot implement that in our context or in our community. I'm happy to mention all of these examples because actually I was here in one of the panels, not in this conference or forum, but in different forums, saying that we have these challenges, we need this and we need that, but now I can say that, yeah, we have these practices, we have these promising practices, let's build on that together with the international community, with the humanitarian community, and let's serve the survivors more. Let's be more effective in our response by using the know-how that women-led organizations and local actors have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wuthal. Also, thank you very much for reflecting on what it means for localization to actually happen. You know, we speak a lot about locally led efforts. It helps when we bring to light practical examples, you know, that address procurement, funding, operational challenges, and also, you know, highlighting how language matters. Language is a key aspect of this that often gets missed. So thank you very much. So my second question goes to Fatima. So let me ask you, how does your organization promote survivor-centered programming that is centered around the voices of women and girls in humanitarian assistance?
Thank you very much, Amira, and good afternoon, colleagues. It is indeed a privilege for me to be here and to be on this panel. Firstly, I would like to say that conflict-related sexual violence is quite important because it affects women and girls. Women and girls are used as targets. However, unless we're able to work on the broader issues and then look at those issues and address them holistically, or to adopt a holistic approach, I don't think we will be able to achieve the desired outcome, which is sustainable impact. So coming now to your question, here is what we do in my organization. What we do is we put communities, and in this sense, we put women and girls at the center of our programming. How do we do that? We involve them in the planning and in the designing of all our projects. Women and girls know what their priorities are. They know what their needs are. So when we consult them, we're able to design projects that are useful to them and that are also sustainable and impactful. Most often than not, projects are pre-designed on all our behalf. And in that way, it takes away, especially for women and girls, their voice and their agency. I want to give a very particular example. In my organization, we have a Dignity Kits Production Center. As you may be aware, northeastern Nigeria, where I come from, is in over a decade-long conflict, and majority of those that are affected are actually women and girls. And then a large number of those women and girls are of reproductive age. So because of the interaction that we have with communities and the engagement, we've come to realize there's a great issue of pad poverty, which has led us to actually design together with them using locally available resources to produce sanitary pads that are washable. So what we do is target specifically also survivors of sexual and gender-based violence as those that produce the sanitary pads. You all will agree with me that there is a direct relationship between lack of empowerment and sexual and gender-based violence. Most often than not, some of these survivors are abducted, of course, by the Boko Haram. Aside from the stigma that they face when they return back to their communities, there's this issue of lack of empowerment. So even within their communities, even within their families, they lose their voices because they come most often than not with children who now become liabilities in those communities. With the stipend that we're able to provide to them in the production center, they're able to cater for themselves, they're able to cater for the children, they're able to support the family, and that gives them a sense of belonging, but importantly, a voice. In the beginning, we noticed that when they return to these communities, even during family gatherings and family meetings, they hardly speak out. They are seen as liability in addition to the stigma that they face. So these women you see from the day-to-day engagement and the way they interact in those communities that they've gotten their voices back. On the contrary, and majority of the time, when projects are pre-designed and given to us and to them, what actually happens is that we are given a predetermined budget. In fact, sometimes even the number of staff to be used in those projects are already determined. Locations are already determined for us, usually not flexible, not long-term. And then it is surprising that at the end of the day, we question that there is little or no impact. I'm asking you, how can there be impact? All the steps that are necessary to be taken have not been taken. And usually, the affected community, who are supposed to be in the center of the response, are the ones that suffer. We as women-led organizations are part of this community, and in that regard, we are closely connected. So most often than not, we consult with them, and we're able to identify what those priorities are, and are able to better design projects that are suited to address their realities. So women-led organizations implement through the international community because we do not have resources of our own. In my organization, what we adopt is equitable partnership. Equitable partnership not only with communities, but also with international organizations as well. And that way, I want to assure us that if we are also able to all adopt equitable partnership, then collectively we can be able to achieve it. We're able to achieve the sustainable impact that we all desire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima, for the important work you do with women and girls in Nigeria, and also for sharing with us, key examples of how this is actually done on the ground. The importance of flexible funding as well for humanitarian assistance and for the work with women and girls is very important when we want to achieve sustainable impact that addresses gender-based violence and emergencies. Thank you. The last question I have is for Lindsay. If you could share with us, how do you believe we can ensure that provision of survivor-centered services addressing sexual violence and conflict remain the priority in national and international efforts from a programmatic as well as a policy perspective? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amira. It's an honor to be on the panel today with such distinguished speakers and to really hear some very thoughtful insights from Wassel and Fatima in terms of how their organizations are working on the ground. I really want to echo some of the thoughts that they shared already to say it's not an easy task to ensure that we're taking a survivor-centered approach and that this approach is prioritized. However, ensuring a survivor-centered approach to CRSV means we need to ensure that our response is appropriate, it's timely, that we have high quality services, and this has to be integrated throughout healthcare for survivors, psychological support, legal support, all the way up to livelihood support. A survivor-centered approach, as our colleagues have mentioned, it restores the agency of survivors, and it really treats them not just as passive beneficiaries, but as stakeholders and co-creators of solutions, and I think we'll hear more about that today. It ensures that approaches are tailored to their specific experiences and needs, and I think it's important that we also bear in mind that survivors are not a homogeneous group. They have diverse identities, and these identities are shaped by intersecting factors such as race, ability, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Unfortunately, as we've been hearing a lot today at this forum this morning, humanitarian needs have been increasing around the world, and humanitarian assistance is not keeping pace. Especially in the GBV space, we know that it is less than 1% of all GBV funding globally. That's why it's essential at both levels that the needs of survivors of CRSV must be considered. So this means at the national level and also at the international level in all of our decision making. And we do have frameworks. We have national policies, both legal frameworks, national action plans on 1325. We also even have political agreements on CRSV. And these types of agreements, they can foster an environment that enables inclusion of survivors' needs in these programs. At the international level, inclusion of their needs in humanitarian response plans, as has been mentioned, it's important, but it must also then equal in the amount of investment that's made. We can do a lot when it comes to assessments and planning and programming, but if we don't invest proportionately to the scale of the problem, we're not going to be able to come up with these innovative and creative programming to address CRSV. I'm really pleased to be able to share with you today that the work that we're discussing is really the raison d'etre of the UN Action Against Sexual Violence and Conflict Network. And we're a network of 24 UN agencies that's coordinating across the UN system with the goal of ending sexual violence in the wake of armed conflict. Our chair is the special representative of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, Ms. Pramila Patten. And the UN Action Network, we coordinate across the triple nexus to prevent and address CRSV. We're also really trying to leverage the strategic and political advocacy role of SRSG Patten to elevate the voices of survivors and to advance concretely what it means to employ a multi-sectoral survivor-centered approach, both at the political and programmatic responses. So we're really trying to break down many of these silos that have been discussed. We've also been really trying to break boundaries when it comes to understanding anticipatory action, understanding how CRSV can be prevented. And as a network, we're constantly asking ourselves, how can the tragic impact of CRSV be drastically reduced? What do tailored survivor-centered services actually look like in specific contexts where we're working? And what kind of investment is needed to stop this crime from happening in the first place? And so for this reason, last year, UN Action developed the first of its kind prevention framework on CRSV to provide both national and international actors not only with tools, but of concrete case studies, concrete examples of how actually we are stopping CRSV in the first instance, and how we can also mitigate further harm to survivors. I think there's no question that the scale and complexity of challenges to tackle CRSV require sustained collaboration, including partnerships with EU member states, all other member states, UN entities, the international donor community, civil society organizations, women's rights organizations, and we've also been talking more and more about the private sector. It's much easier said than done, and as we've been hearing from many speakers today, we need more innovative approaches. And that's why at UN Action, we also have a multi-partner trust fund. It's a place for us to coordinate all of our efforts through a holistic response to CRSV. And this means, as I mentioned, that we really have to keep up our advocacy to ensure that the investment is commensurate with the actions that we need to prevent this crime. I'm really proud to say that in Ukraine, we have an excellent example of how this working as one approach can best serve survivors and their communities. Last year, following SRSG Patton's political level engagement in May with the Ukrainian government, where she signed a framework of cooperation on behalf of the UN system, this network, we proposed a coordinated, multi-sectoral, comprehensive joint project. And this project looks at how we can strengthen not only the capacity of Ukrainian institutions, but also local-led women's organizations, including healthcare and psychosocial assistance. I think this is also something that was really stressed by the Deputy Prime Minister this morning in the panel on Ukraine, how critical psychosocial trauma-informed support is at this moment. And also other relevant services to provide the support that's needed for local-led women's organizations and civil society organizations, including Survivors Network, to effectively design and implement restorative measures for survivors of CRSV. In closing, I really want to recognize the uniqueness of conflict-related sexual violence. I think for many people, this crime is unthinkable. It leaves them feeling hopeless. It leaves them feeling like it's simply too difficult to address. But we must remember that this is an unthinkable crime that's also a reality for men, women, boys, and girls around the world right now in conflict settings. So instead, I want to leave you with a message of hope, because I think for those of us who are working on CRSV every day, what I can share with you is that where we see political commitments, political declarations matched equally with investment, we have seen change. And I think our colleagues have shared some of those very concrete changes today. So UN Action, through collaborating with and leveraging strength of women in Somalia, for example, we were able to mitigate the impacts of CRSV and prevent violent extremism through supporting the rehabilitation and integration of more than 230 women who were formerly associated with violent extremist groups, and many of whom were survivors of CRSV. And this project was culturally grounded. It assisted women to recover from trauma. It also empowered them economically to support them to be active contributors in their community. And this is critical for sustainable peace building, and we know that. So this is breaking the cycle of conflict. The work of UN Action in Ukraine and Somalia that I shared with you today, it's only two examples of how well-funded collaborative approaches by all stakeholders give us a realistic path to prevent and mitigate CRSV. And investing in these efforts also ensures that survivors of CRSV are positioned to reclaim their lives, they're empowered to pursue future of their choosing, and can also help build more secure, prosperous future. CRSV is war's oldest crime, and we must keep up our advocacy and awareness raising to ensure it remains central to the conversation as part of our collective efforts to build more peaceful and sustainable societies. So I'm really grateful to be here with you today having this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Thank you for sharing more on the multi-sectoral collaborative approach to response, reminding us of the importance of trauma-informed response to sexual violence in conflict, as well as reminding us that our survivors are not homogeneous. They come in, a multitude of identities and diversity, and our response must match this diversity as well. Thank you. So thanks very much to all our speakers. We now move to our questions from the audience, questions and reflections. We already have two interventions from the audience. So if we can get a mic here. I invite everyone who would like to participate in the question session to, just raise your hand after the colleagues have shared.
Thank you so much. My name is Catherine Nightingale. I head up the advocacy and policy team at CARE International UK, but I'm also one part of the external engagement for the programme What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls. Firstly, I just want to say that was a really fantastic panel, and I really appreciated the different examples of what's happening already to really address the conflict-related sexual violence piece. For the What Works programme, we did a synthesis report, and some of you will have received on your chairs or in your hands a copy of the synthesis report looking across the existing evidence of what does work and where that evidence is strong and where it needs to be continued to be built. And I just wanted to reflect a couple of things from that and ask a question to the panel about evidence. So maybe if I tell you what I'm going to ask you, you can perhaps be thinking a bit about it, because I'm really interested in how we can continue to build the evidence around what works to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. What our research showed is that there are some examples. Violence prevention is possible, and we heard that from a number of our panelists, but it's stronger evidence from particular contexts. It's often quite specific to context. It's often not from necessarily scaled solutions. So we're really interested to understand more about where people have examples of evidence and where large-scale programs are integrating evidence gathering as part of their program process. Just to flag, in the report, we particularly looked at the socio-ecological framework for designing, for drivers of CSRV and the forms of conflict-related violence against women and girls at the individual, interpersonal, community, institutional and societal level. And we looked also at kind of the different intervention moments, both pre-conflict, at the moment of conflict, in protracted crisis and the different models that we're seeing stronger evidence coming out, and in the post-conflict setting. So I'd really encourage people to go to the website or to grab a copy afterwards. And for those of you that are working in the practice of it, I wanted to flag this fantastic tool that tells you very simply how strong the evidence currently is. So if you're wanting to understand how to use evidence in your program design or in your interventions, you can have quite a good understanding of where that evidence is really robust. But for those of us that are thinking about how to continue to build the evidence base, it also tells you where we need to continue to invest to build that evidence base. And I think that's what I'd just love to hear from the panel. How can we get a stronger investment in those areas that are still not yet well evidenced about what is effective, and where arguably we're starting from scratch in different interventions and not necessarily drawing enough on the evidence around what works. And to our next intervention.
Thank you, Catherine. We had a tiny accident. It's fine. Nobody got hurt. No worries. So now, okay, so we have a question in the back. So we'll take two more. If you can introduce yourself before you ask the question.
Hi, I'm Kirsten from ActionAid Spain. Thanks to all the speakers for their interventions. You've mentioned the importance of political will, and building on that, I mean, this session is incorporated into the agenda of the Humanitarian Forum as a humanitarian talk. It's not part of the official agenda itself, which points to perhaps the level of importance that sexual and gender-based violence continues to receive within the humanitarian system. And building on that further, in 2023, we are going to see, a new iteration of the Grand Bargain, a key humanitarian policy framework, which itself is very weak in terms of its incorporation of a gender focus. So I was wondering what the view of the speakers is in this sense.
Thank you. So the third intervention here.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Erika Velosa. I'm from Colombia. I am the director of organization that is working with sexual and gender-based violence victims. We have, as you know, in Colombia, a triple situation. We have a very long history of patriarchalism situations that promote violence as form sometimes of the relationship between the people. At the same time, we have a very long history of conflict, and we have a very big migration that we call the mixed flow migration, mostly from Venezuela. So the people who come from Venezuela sometimes arrive to places who have been suffered armed conflict. And in that zones, there are more in risk, and they don't know too much about that. And of course, a lot of the people who have been a victim of sexual violence, of gender-based violence in the conflict, sometimes have not to move, or sometimes they are displaced. And in that sense, they are in risk for another zones of violence that sometimes are promoting trafficking, trade, sexual exploitation, and other kinds of violence. In that sense, what we find normally is the victims of this kind of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict have been victims in all their lives since they were a child. And they have suffered sometimes sexual abuse in the family, sometimes abuse, physical abuse, and of course, their responses in psychosocial needs are not so simple because they have sometimes trauma and they have a long history of abuse that are not solved, not by the government, not by the humanitarian action, not by the NGOs, because that it requires not only a survivor approach, that requires a sensitive trauma approach, that requires a humanitarian action approach, and at the same time, all the protection that for example, CEDAW or the CDN, the Child Convention is asking us. One of the things that we have shared as more difficult in all the reparation system is precisely the mental health and psychosocial support of all these victims. And what we see is there is a lot of action related with humanitarian responses in Colombia, but I would say that less than the 5% of the projects have that approach of psychosocial support. And the people don't know how to handle these mixed questions related about this long history of violence, and at the same time, this connection between all these things. We said in Colombia that everything happens in Colombia, and the people is resistant and resilient, and because of that, they survive. But it doesn't mean that the approach is correct for all this complexity that sometimes is similar to other countries, as the countries that my other colleagues from NGOs has. So, of course, my call here is to put the efforts in that line, because the people who haven't had the possibility to recover about these impacts in their bodies, in their minds, in their relationship, is going to be more vulnerable to repeat another violence because their protection is gone. And in that sense, what we are going to find is in complex conditions, in complex contexts, is the people who the offenders, who the abusers is going to find. And is going to be the people who is going to enter into the trafficking, into the trade, into all the sexual exploitation situation that we are facing right now. And my ask in that sense is to imagine how this triple nexus is going to work related with psychosocial support. And this particular risk is not only something theoretical, it implies actions that connect not only the psychosocial support in a level that is all the people can do, is more specialized, and at the same time that requires an action related with the development, humanitarian action, peace building, but in the real life. And I invite you to invest in Colombia for we could find the answers. We have a lot of experience there, but we need your help. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Smriti here, Smriti Patel from A4EP. So I just wanted to take us a bit higher level, because one thing is doing prevention and protection and all of that in terms of the actual, once it's happened. but I wonder how much focus is there or at political level to reduce the conflicts, because we focus so much on programming and all of this, but that level, I think there's lack of engagement on that, and that is crucial because this is what is driving, so drivers of the conflict. And the second one is that how do we actually, and I think I just wanted to take up what Fatima was saying, that on one hand, actually there's another thing. This morning was really striking, and I was talking to Suzanne about this, that the whole first section was totally white, male-dominated. We had 3 female, but it was totally white-dominated. Now, and these are hugely developed countries, they have lots of resources, and yet still there is lack of diversity and gender equity. And here we are talking about places where there's conflicts, right? How can we, and I keep hearing things about feminine leadership and feminine policies and all of that, but where is it in action in the countries where the funding is coming from? And then how we're really supporting women like Fatima and many others who are the ones who are working on the ground. So there's, different layers, but I just want to put that question because if we see what we saw this morning, wow, we've got a long, long way to go. Sorry to put that in.
No, thank you very much. And allow me to move to our speakers so we have time to answer. We have 4 questions, one on building the evidence, another one on turning the political will or commitments into action, a statement on psychosocial support and mental health and psychosocial support, and finally the engagement on the drivers of conflict and how to ensure feminist leadership in action takes place within donor countries. Thank you so much, and I invite our speakers. Susanne, yeah. Okay, so Susanne.
Should I start? So then maybe I start with the last point. So I had wished that my foreign minister would have been there because she could have broken the cycle, because she's a young woman and she's very engaged, and as I said, she just launched the guidelines, so you can be assured that it is very much on her mind, and whenever she goes abroad, she brings with her women. So women as press officers, women as political officers, and she tells us that people on the other side act surprised and always come up with excuses why they haven't brought any women. So I think this is something that helps as well in this regard, but there's a lot of work to do. So maybe on, it was mentioned Nexus. Nexus is always a very good point in case, also for sexual violence and conflict, because we don't have to see this as a silo, but it's across the board. So, and one thing that, for example, we fund is the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which brings the peace component together with the humanitarian component, and really going local, bringing locals in, as it was said. So this is really the way to go, and as you put it well, Fatima, it is about the voice heard, being part of the discussion and having dignity. So this is what, of course, we try with different programming and trying really to listen and what should be done. So this is a very important point. As well on the mixed flows, so we fund programs with IOM, focusing very much on psychosocial support, which is key in so many emergencies. And then on the grand bargain, which was a very specific question, yes, I wasn't there when it started, but I know that there was a big discussion if there should be a special caucus on gender. But then it was decided, no, this should be mainstreamed through everything. So localization is about women, and quality funding is about women. And so, yes, it's not a specific caucus, but I think it is there whenever the members of the Grand Bargain talk about it, but I agree it maybe should even be more stressed and sort of put out there. So, and maybe I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne. Would you like to take a question, Wusa?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think I will be answering the evidence-based question based on the the experience that I have, which is like very small. I mean, like we could build this evidence-based by the support of the donors who have courage to step in and support directly or in a consortium form of funding. So the courage and I don't want to say it as risk, because yeah, we know the trust thing is there, but let's have this as a practice for all of us to be best practice very soon, to have more support from donors, different donors, humanitarian and international donors, to step into women-led organizations, local actors, to support, to build that evidence more strongly, and to have it as a big best practice, like in the middle of the humanitarian context and the humanitarian donors. Thank you.
Thank you, and addressing the needs that funding would go to evidence building as part of humanitarian assistance, which is very often a challenge when we are seeing humanitarian funding, and how donors may not be willing to look at the learning aspect of programming, which is very much needed in humanitarian sector. Fatima, thank you.
So I think in addition to what Wissal has said, probably from a slightly different perspective, and in trying to answer the question on evidence, I think I will say that in a lot of contexts, evidence already exists. If we try to really appreciate and reinforce the work that is already being done, and then rather than every time coming to try to reinvent the wheel, I think that steps in a lot of time in I think downplaying the evidence that already exists, which is usually from the local or from the community perspective. Most often than not, we come in to do research, we come in to do a lot of assessment. I think coming in with a perspective that we're coming to do something better. Failing to recognize that already on ground, some of these things already exist in different ways. And so the realization now, and even trying to put the question on building evidence, for me, I think is a step forward, because then we're now beginning to recognize, the capacities that does already exist and what work is already being done on ground. So I think that in itself is an answer to your question. So probably, of course, from the perspective of resources, when she is bringing in the donor perspective, but I think it's now also having the courage to come into communities with that open-mindedness of wanting to learn of what is already there, and I think from there taking it probably further along the lines of complementing what already exists. Secondly, regarding drivers of conflict, I think if we really want to fight conflict-related sexual violence, gender-based violence, sexual, and whichever way we want to call it, I think that is the most important thing to do. Most often than not, we focus more on response and mitigation, which is usually short-term. We really need to look at the longer-term way of addressing it, and how do we do that without addressing the root causes. So that is where to start. Of course, we can continue our work on prevention, on response mitigation, but what are the root causes? Why do we have those conflicts in the first place? I think will all save us the much needed money that we're saying is not enough. So once we address those, I think we're going to get the answers to that. So maybe these two questions, and then somebody else. Thank you.
I think we have space for one more question. If no further questions, we can move on to Lindsay's statement. Okay, thank you.
I just maybe wanted to address the question of mental health because I think it's a really important one, and I'm glad that it's coming more and more into these spaces. I think we should really start thinking of psychosocial assistance, as it's also called, or trauma-informed mental health services, as part of that critical package that survivors receive. Just as we think about, PEP kits, dignity kits, that psychosocial assistance or trauma-informed mental health care is a requirement. And often we also talk about accompanying survivors, let's say on their justice and accountability journey if they decide to access this. I think when it comes to mental health, we should also think this is not a type of assistance, especially for survivors of CRSV, that's a one-off counseling session. Survivors are often deeply traumatized. It's a crime that's stigmatized. Many of them are rejected from their families, from their communities. So the level of trauma, deep trauma, that not only impacts that survivor, but has a ripple effect in their families, in their communities, we can't underestimate it. And I think really in the humanitarian space, we need to start looking at how we can invest more in really trauma-informed mental health services for survivors if we're serious about taking a survivor-centered approach in the work we're doing.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think with this, we have answered the questions, and I want to thank all our speakers as well as our audience for your statements and questions. This is a very diverse panel indeed, and it brings in, multiple voices to this very important discussion. So, as you said, collaboration is very much needed, and this is a statement in itself. So I really want to thank you for your participation, and I will now hand it over to Ambassador Ghislaine Dube to provide us with some closing reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira. Sorry. When you're a white male diplomat in advanced middle age, and you listen to this, there is only one word that comes to mind, and that is, or two words, is humility and respect. I've been so touched by what I've heard, by the, one can only imagine being with you on the ground, with the picture we see here. Nobody has referred to this picture. I've been watching it. I've taken a lot of notes, and I was thinking one way, one way of wrapping it up would be to do something very old-fashioned. Is to make a word cloud. And I could have 20, 30 principles, key priorities, which we could bring into a word cloud. But I felt that was a bit facetious. So I'm going to do two things, if you don't mind. I am a Belgian diplomat, and I represent my ministry and my minister, who is a lady, a woman. I represent the Belgian, a feminist foreign policy, like Germany, which has taken the lead. My foreign minister, who is of Algerian origin, who is a former newscaster and has entered politics a year ago, is very engaged in not just women's issues, but in sexual violence, in rights of women, and she has gladly taken up the German lead to fashion our foreign policy and give it a feminist priority. So maybe we shouldn't always look at the messenger and maybe listen to the message. I'm just a messenger here, but the message is clear. The message is that we need more feminist foreign policy, we need more humanitarian focused foreign policy, and certainly as far as Belgium is concerned, we are including systematically humanitarianism, the rights of women, gender violence in every single intervention we do. We are very proud to be a member of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which is currently sitting, has been sitting for 2 weeks. It's an extremely unpleasant environment. It's called the Human Rights Council. It's a diplomatic forum. Not all UN member states are represented, but it is a forum which is turning into the defense of national interests, right? Belgium's national interest is feminist foreign policy. It's the defense of rights, defense of victims. We don't call them victims, we call them survivors. So we are giving money to that. Not enough, it's never enough. But the money is given according to the precepts that you've all brought forward. So it's very enlightening to listen to you speaking and to listen also to the questions from the audience, because they show us that we think that we're on the right track with the principles that underpin our foreign policy and our donorship. We've all talked about accountability, about survivor-centered approach, a protective environment for survivors. Women, peace and security agenda has not been mentioned, or only in passing, but that is also a key part of our foreign policy. So I wanted to point that out, that not just as Belgium, also as a host nation to the EU, as a very active UN member, we attached so much importance to everything you have said and you have done. Now, the second thing, I would just, 2 minutes, I would, instead of the wordplay, I would like us to imagine the following situation. We're going to imagine an onion. We're going to imagine 5, 6 concentric circles. And at the heart of these concentric circles are the survivors, are the people who have fallen victim to the foulest acts imaginable that people can do to each other, whose courage is very often completely undervalued, and who, as you have said, who not just need support, need healing, medical healing, but they need psychological healing, as you've said. And the support they need has to come, and this is the second circle, from their community, from their families, and from their community. We haven't talked about the importance of community leaders, for instance. Maybe of training us, finding some funding to train community leaders, to make them aware of the responsibility they have of caring, but also of offering, you said it, hope, offering a perspective to these people. So that could be a priority in our policy. And now, of course, we come to the third level. And the third level is, you mentioned it as well, local and regional politics. You mentioned it. Politics is indeed extremely important and is vastly insufficient what we do. We are aware. But if through advocacy and to concrete steps and funding that our governments do, to favor, as you said, results-based action, to favor training and making sure that the accountability at the regional and local level is ensured by those who fund them. So to make it an even stronger commitment and an even stronger requirement of our funding, that is probably also really needed if we want to help the survivors. And we can think of many more levels, but of course the fourth layer is the international one, the one I think that brings us here together. And it is, I agree with you, and I think it's a conclusion also from this talk, it is remarkable to see that there is progress. We must be grateful for this progress, but I think if there's any obligation, maybe in this room and in this wider room here, it is to work together to form a coalition of the willing, a coalition of those who really want to root out this violence. And I thank you for your commitment.
Thank you very much to all our speakers and to our guests. Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have moderated this session, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. We've circulated a registration form in case you want to stay in touch with us. Thank you very much.